Okay, hello and welcome to our webinar today. I am Kieran O'Keeffe, partner at Dentons Global Advisers in Brussels, and we are here today to discuss the AI Act and in particular general purpose AI, which I am going to refer to as GPI for the duration of this discussion this afternoon. Following the draft AI Act proposal by the Commission in 2021, many AI experts have highlighted the need for the AI Act to deal with the ongoing trend towards more general AI systems. This has led to calls to regulate general purpose AI, or what has been called the brain of AI. We're here today to discuss that brain and the most effective way to regulate them to ensure that they are safe. The concepts of GPI properly arrived on the scene with the May 2022 proposal by the French presidency of the EU. In this proposal, the presidency identified a number of articles in the Act that need to specifically apply to GPI, including articles on risk management, systems and data governance. The current Czech presidency has reaffirmed this overall approach, but has proposed that GPI are regulated through implementing acts. There are various factions in the Parliament that have tabled a wide range of proposals on this topic. Some have copied the French proposal. Others have suggested that all AI systems with indeterminate uses, another way to describe GPI, are classified as high risk. A third group within Renew in the European Parliament has instead suggested that only requirements around cybersecurity, accuracy, and robustness should be imposed. As we are now approaching the final discussions in the Parliament and with the trialogue on the horizon, the question becomes, how can we best tackle GPI in the final legal text? And we have an excellent panel of speakers here this afternoon with us to discuss this subject. Kilian has been Head of Unit for Policy Development and Coordination in relation to AI since January 2020. Prior to this, Kilian was a member of the Cabinet of Commissioner Oettinger, a role he fulfilled from 2015, and between 2010 and 2015, Kilian was Deputy and Acting Head of Units in DG Energy, where he dealt with policy coordination in the energy sector. And he started his Commission career in the legal service, and before that as an in-house lawyer specialising in competition. Jenny Brennan is a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute, where she leads work on ethics and accountability in practice. Her research includes methods for inspecting and assessing algorithmic systems and their impact on people and society. Bridging policy and technology, Jenny brings data engineering experience from Twitter and Entrepreneur First, as well as consulting with early stage startups or projects ranging from developing AI personal assistants to software for kids learning to code. Mark Brakel is the Future of Life Institute's Director of Policy, coordinating the organisation's global advocacy and policy efforts with the European institutions in Brussels, the US federal government, and the United Nations. He works to limit the risks from artificial intelligence to society and to expand support for a treaty on lethal autonomous weapons. Before joining FLI, Mark was in the Dutch civil service and served as a diplomat in the Netherlands embassy in Iraq. He holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy, politics, and economics from the University of Oxford and has a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. We will also be joined shortly by Brando Benifei, although he's not currently on the call. He will be joining us momentarily. Brando joined the European Parliament in 2014, serving in his first mandate on the Employment Committee in the European Parliament. Since 2019, he's been a member of the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection. In 2020, he joined the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age and is currently co-rapporteur on the Artificial Intelligence Act. In a moment, I'm going to ask our speakers to make some short opening remarks. For our participants, I should let you know that if you would like to ask a question, then there is a Q&A function where you can post a message, and I will take questions from there as our discussion progresses and pose them to our panelists. I would also just briefly like to draw your attention to the Global AI Survey, which is being developed by our colleagues at Dentons. which is assessing the extent of business readiness for AI transformation. This can be found on the Dentons website, and my colleague Julia will be emailing attendees afterwards with a link to that survey, and you are more than welcome to participate in it. So, we've had an introduction to today's discussion, and let's start with some opening remarks from our speakers on GPI. So, Kilian, as the Commission with the original authors of the AI Act, perhaps you could start us off with your thinking. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kieran, and thanks a lot for having me here today on this important discussion. Indeed, general purpose AI or foundational AI is an increasing branch of AI, and therefore the questions which we're addressing today are of increasing importance. And how to get the regulation right, meaning how to make sure that these systems are as trustworthy as other AI systems, which have a dedicated purpose, intended purpose from the beginning, on the one hand side, and on the other side, not to prevent the further development of these often as well very promising systems in AI, to help us as well in Europe to innovate and to be at the forefront of cutting edge AI. Perhaps I can just summarize a little bit the journey which we did already on general purpose AI. Kieran highlighted already the big landmarks, but I may dig a little bit deeper perhaps. When we did our proposal, we had in April 2021, we had not a specific provision on AI. This is correct. Nevertheless, general purpose AI was not excluded from the regulation, on the contrary, because our understanding was that with our proposal, every AI system which would not particularly exclude high-risk purposes would fall under the regulation. So the presumption was, that we have taken a horizontal approach in the AI Act, we have taken a product-based approach, and the determining factor for the risk classification is the intended purpose of a given system. So what do you want to do with that system? If a general purpose AI system would include as well high-risk purposes, in our understanding in the initial proposal, it would become a high-risk system in that respect, which would need to undergo the ex-ante conformity assessment and would need to comply with the requirements for high-risk systems. So it was not excluded. Of course, there was the possibility always for the provider to explicitly exclude the uses foreseen in the different annexes in the regulation, and by that avoiding having to comply with the AI regulation in this respect with the requirements for high-risk systems. Nevertheless, if in that case, that was our initial proposal, if in that case a provider down the line would decide to use, for instance, the general purpose AI or the language processing tool, for instance, for a high-risk purpose, this second provider would then become the provider of the high-risk system and would then need to undergo the ex-ante conformity assessment. We would expect, that was our presumption, that then the provider of the general purpose AI, for instance, the language processing tool, would cooperate on a commercial basis with the provider down the line, who would then give a specific purpose to the AI system. So that would be because there would be a commercial interest in order to allow to exploit all possible uses of this AI system. There should be a commercial incentive for the provider of the general purpose AI to work together with the provider of the AI, which would use that general purpose AI for a specific high-risk purpose. That was our vision, which we laid out in the initial proposal. Just to be very clear, because if you look at this, you will not find a specific chapter, but this was the way how we understood the general rules would apply to general purpose AI. Then, as we went along, I have as well to say that the market development and the technological development, if you look at GPT-3 and so on, have really taken speed, and the topic was much more prominent on the table than it was perhaps when we started this process. The Slovenian presidency reflected on this, and they took the decision to take general purpose AI out of the scope of the regulation, to exempt it, and only to kick in once a high-risk purpose was given to the specific system. This led to, I think, really triggered then really a lot of public discussion in the parliament, but as well as a lot of stakeholders, and even some quite strong reactions. And I think as a reaction to this public debate, the French presidency then tried to modify this approach again and went a little bit back backwards towards the original Commission thinking, but now explicitly stating this in the Act, namely by putting into the Act that the AI, the general purpose AI, should be subject to the regulation with certain adaptations based on the fact that general purpose AI has not just one specific purpose, but it's open for a lot of different purposes. So they try to adapt the requirements, unless there was a specific exception. It was explicitly clarified by the provider that all high-risk use cases were exempted. And there was now what we foresaw as a kind of commercial interoperation has become now a legal obligation, namely between the provider of the general purpose AI to cooperate with the provider down the line who would give a specific purpose to that system. So now there's the idea of a legal obligation to cooperate between these two. And they introduce an exception for SMEs. So if SMEs would come and produce a general purpose AI, they would at this stage be accepted from the obligations. The Czech presidency now has developed this, and on this basis, I think has fine-tuned this model, which the French have introduced a bit further. They mainly have not specified in detail how the adaptation of the requirements to the general purpose AI should really be worked out, but they have foreseen an implementing act for the Commission, which should be adopted within 18 months after the entry into force of this regulation, where the specificities, the detailed application or adaptation of the requirements should be fixed in order to make clear how the requirements would have to be applied to a general purpose AI in order to be appropriate. In addition, they've foreseen a second implementing act in order to specify which kind of information the provider of general purpose AI would have to give to the provider who would attach a specific purpose to this AI and would then make it a specific high-risk AI system. This is now the proposal which is on the table and which is supposed, we have to see what happens, but which is supposed to be adopted by the ministers on the 6th of December in order to agree on a general approach. And that would, in that case, if the ministers then agree, would become the starting point for the council to negotiate. But as Kieran already pointed out, and I think that's a very important point, this is only, of course, one side of the table or of the medal. The other side is the European Parliament, where the discussion is still going on, and the European Parliament is still reflecting on finding its position or concluding on its decision. There are different views and different ideas how to do this. But then, of course, afterwards, there will be the trilogues, and the final outcome will then depend on how the European Parliament positions itself and what is then the final line on which both institutions can agree. I hope this gives you a first overview of where we stand currently. Thanks.
Thank you, Kilian. Jenny, can I ask you, please, just to give your perspective and the perspective of the Ada Lovelace Institute?
Thanks so much, Kieran. I'm really happy to get the opportunity to discuss general purpose AI and the kind of implications of this changing AI value chain. These issues are really essential to adequately answer the question of how to regulate increasingly powerful systems and to have a future-proofed AI Act. So general purpose AI presents potentially a more complex value chain than many of the context-specific AI systems people have been often thinking about and discussing in the regulatory space. And the proposition of these being increasingly the norm as performance of more generalized models rapidly increases and the adaptation and adoption into products is happening at pace. So the AI value chain really involves multiple providers in the parlance of the AI Act, which would be developers of AI models and users, which would be deployers. But that simple delineation is not perfectly fitting through the context of general purpose AI systems. In some cases, there'll be those fine tuners in the middle who build on top of AI models, end users who then operate the system, for example, in the workplace. And most importantly, from our perspective at Ada, affected persons at the end of the value chain, people whose lives these systems impact. So imagine you might have a language generation model like GPT-3, which might be embedded into a product to generate copy for adverts, which may in turn be used by a company to generate a job advert. And then might then be viewed and interpreted by a person and applicant at the other end. And any of these kind of product implementation adaptations will have lots of different stages in those processes. And it's the impact of AI systems on affected persons in society that we're most concerned about. And it's clear that there are certain risks of harm to people which can emerge from the upstream design and development. For example, we've seen kind of text generation models propagating extremist content or bias against different groups based on training data from the web, or image generation models, results being skewed by gender or race when prompted with particular adjectives or roles, or behaviors of humans. So how can we think about mitigating harms in the AI framework? Well, risks can emerge in the AI systems during design, development, and deployment, and thereon through the AI lifecycle. These systems are dynamic as they evolve or adapt and can operate at a really global scale. So we think that mitigating these risks and harms involves clearly designating responsibility. And for us, there's 3 layers to this. Some requirements only the provider can do, some that should be done by the user, and some that should be done by both provider and user. However, I have to say a fair designation of responsibility is not the end of the conversation. When we talk about responsibility in the value chain, we also have to think what that means. Many providers argue that it's hard to mitigate downstream risks as they're dependent on the context of use. Yet at the same time, many of these general purpose AI providers also represent powerful players at the start of the value chain, which many smaller providers rely upon. So options could include things like know your customer requirements, requiring developers of the most cutting edge foundational models to interrogate who their clients are, the intended uses, and confirm if those uses end up taking place. There needs to be an incentive on providers to check who they're selling to, else you could end up with a market where tool providers are selling to anyone with no due diligence requirements. And this matters because at the end of the day, we can't talk about general purpose AI and the value chain without considering those impacted by the cutting edge systems we're talking about. A more holistic approach is needed beyond just designating responsibilities in the value chain. Those who are affected should be involved in the entire process, from standards development to future oversight and governance. And this kind of interventions from here may range from independently and adequately resourced oversight body with a fundamental rights remit through to considerations of fundamental rights impact assessments. And most importantly, the inclusion of affected persons in standard setting bodies and institutions. So we're really seeing a need for a kind of holistic consideration across the value chain of different implications of general purpose AI, and really excited to discuss that further with everyone today.
Thank you, Jenny. That was a very helpful primer for the discussion. Mark, can I ask you to give your and FLI's perspective, please, on the discussion topic?
Yes, thank you, Kieran, for inviting us on this panel. And I won't go into the value chain, I think, as Jenny has done that, and I won't possibly be able to repeat that. What I'd like to focus on a little bit is why we care about these systems as FLI, as well as the definition. And I think the reason why we care so much about these systems is because, and I think as Kilian already highlighted, that these systems were brought up by many AI researchers and developers when they looked at the AI Act as something that was emerging just around when the text was first published. But we also care because of the harms. And in the United States, Representative Esho in the House of Representatives 2 months ago called for the regulation of these systems in a US context after Stable Diffusion came out. And Stable Diffusion is an AI model that allows you to generate images based on text. And I quote the representative who said that this system can be, and reportedly has been, used to create images, including propaganda, violent imagery, pornography, images that potentially violate corporate copyrights, and images used for disinformation and misinformation campaigns. And general purpose AI systems power the development of AI at the moment, but they've also been documented to be Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, to by accident disclose private banking information, to recommend suicide to patients, although in a simulated environment, and to generate fake news. And it's all of these various harms that we are particularly concerned about, especially if they emerge at the beginning, at the source of the value chain, and are not directly put onto the market, but are only discovered further downstream. So then the question, I think, in terms of regulation becomes, if we're concerned about all these harms, how do we define general purpose AI systems? And there's been a lot of discussion that everything is a general purpose AI system. And I really want to push back on that here in this panel. We've written a paper where we've defined general purpose AI systems as AI systems that can accomplish or be adapted to accomplish a range of distinct tasks, including some for which they weren't intentionally trained. And I think that last sentence, including tasks that they weren't intentionally trained for, is a really critical element in the definition. Kilian mentioned GPT-3, which is a system that basically predicts the next word. And it was discovered later that it could also be applied to answering questions, translation, doing basic arithmetic, writing code, and all of these capabilities were capabilities that GPT-3 wasn't specifically trained for. Similarly, Stable Diffusion, designed to generate images, wasn't set up to be a studio for child pornography, but it only became a studio for child pornography after it was released and someone tried to use it in that way. And that is why we are so concerned about these systems, but also why we think that we need to be very careful about the definition, because this definition would not include recommender systems, it would not include voice assistants, and many of the other systems that some have suggested would also fall under this heading. I want to briefly say one word on the economic component, and I hope we get to talk a bit more about that later in the panel. But there's only some companies that really have the capital to be able to produce these systems. And I think we can talk about those companies. It's Meta, it's Google, it's OpenAI, it's Baidu. It's these four companies that are really, really central to the development of foundational or general purpose AI systems at the moment. And similar to the Ada Lovelace Institute, the Future of Life Institute would recommend applying all the requirements of Title III, Chapter 2 to providers, such as making sure that the providers report on cybersecurity, accuracy, robustness, have solid risk management systems, but again, also making sure that users take their responsibility because they know what the specific use case is. So it's really a question about balancing these requirements across the different entities and making sure both groups of parties essentially play the role that they ought to. So in sum, I think we feel it's necessary for allocating the right responsibilities in the value chain, but also to really protect people from harm, that we feel that it's so critical that the AI Act deals with general purpose AI systems in this way.
Thanks very much, Mark, for those introductory remarks. And welcome, Brando, to our discussion here this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. I would like to come to you now to give you the opportunity to ask a few remarks, to give some remarks at the beginning of this discussion. Brando, from early stage in this debate, you and others have talked about no carve-outs for GPI. But of course, the debate has now moved on a little bit, focusing less on if we should regulate GPI, but more how we should regulate GPI. And we would be keen to hear your initial thoughts on that particular point. Brando, please. The floor is yours. You're on mute. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, but I didn't hear very well what you have said. I had some problems in the sound. I don't know why.
No problem. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can you repeat, please? Yes.
Yes. So I was in the introduction, I was just noting the fact that from an early stage in the discussion, you and others have talked about no carve-outs for general purpose AI systems. Of course, the debate has moved on a little bit from if we should regulate those rather than how, so the best way to regulate those. And therefore, I was looking for your initial thoughts on that subject.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for this invitation. I I can't stay very much because we have meetings here in Parliament, but I will try to give a little input on this. We have been working on different topics, but also on I mean, some contentious issues. One of them is this, how we regulate the general purpose AI. We have been discussing where we can find how we can find a balance on avoiding possible loopholes, and at the same time recognize the differences between the different systems that we are regulating. We don't want, and we want to be sure that we do not risk that there is a free hand for those that are producing general purpose AI to just bring all the responsibility, all the situation of checking the impact on fundamental rights and the respect of the rules needed for the system to be operating only on the intermediate user or the final, even the final user. We have been working in general to consider in this chain of responsibility some degree of impact assessment by the users. So a fundamental rights impact assessment is being discussed today, in particular regarding the vulnerable individuals, the stakeholder engagement, and effective enforceability. This is something that also is part of the approach that we are taking on the general purpose AI, that we still haven't concluded what we will actually put as a compromise proposal from the Parliament, but we do not want special categories. We want the rules to be applied for everyone. And we need to look at how, in this specific case, we can ensure that there is the correct allocation of responsibility. So we are working on that, and this is in fact something that in the next weeks will be coming to some solution also in the discussion in the Parliament.
Thank you, Brando, for those initial contributions. And just would like to remind briefly our attendees that if they would like to pose questions, then they can do so through the Q&A function in the webinar. But I'm going to start the discussion by posing some questions to our panelists. In Mark's initial remarks, he talked about the importance of trying to define more precisely what we're talking about when we talk about GPI, and he shared some ideas there for how he thinks a definition could be refined to more precisely target the type of technology that we are really considering. Jenny, I wonder whether or not you had any initial reflections on Mark's perspective, and whether or not you had yourself any views on how more precisely to define what we're talking about. Jenny.
Thanks, Kieran. And yeah, I'd really echo that thought, that I think there's some real sense in thinking about how we refine that definition, where in a broad definition of risk capturing systems that could be used for multiple purposes, but not necessarily in high risk areas. Whereas the target of GPI specific provisions, we're really looking at the most powerful cutting edge systems that are truly kind of multimodal or can be applied to areas that they weren't originally trained for. And this issue in particular, when we're thinking about a lot of things which, when we're looking at risk and we're looking at context, one of the challenges of these systems is that we don't have that upfront context at the point of development of more broad multi-purpose systems, where kind of upstream in the value chain, where it can be difficult to foresee all of the cases that the system could be used for, yet the inputs and process of development and information about that model will be incredibly important throughout the process in terms of understanding potential risks, challenges, and indeed, to Brando's point, fundamental rights impacts, which was very promising to hear about.
Thank you, Jenny. Kilian, the same question to you actually in relation to Mark's remarks and his reflections on how we could more precisely define GPI. Obviously, you've watched, I'm sure, these discussions very carefully as to exactly how to define from a legal perspective what we're talking about, and you yourself in your introductory remarks talked about foundational models rather than using the term GPI. So what are your observations on some of those discussions so far, and where you think some of the interesting ideas might be as to how to precisely define what we're talking about?
Thanks a lot. Well, it is clear whenever we introduce some specific rules for general purpose AI, we need to find some definition, because that's clear in this legal context. The Council, the Presidency has introduced one in Article 3. There's now a definition of general purpose AI. Which takes up, I think, some of the ideas which you have discussed. And the key thing here is, of course, that there are more than one purpose behind such a system. And it may even be intended, it may be used, what it says here, in a plurality of contexts, and may be integrated in a plurality of other AI systems. I think this is one way of expressing this idea. You can, of course, discuss whether this is the best possible way, but this is one way of expressing the idea that you do not have a singular intended purpose, but you may have, this may as well be used kind of a pre-product to build something else on top of this, but will then have a specific purpose, or will narrow down the purpose. This is a bit, I think, the underlying feature. And this is important for our act, because, as I said, for us, the intended purpose is a key feature to identify which kind of risk category you're in, because we really look at this and because that's a bit defining a bit the frame, because the provider defines with the intended purpose for what the system should be used, and he or she tries to make the system then safe and trustworthy for that given intended purpose. That's in the general feature in our system. If then the user goes beyond that intended purpose, this becomes a substantial modification, and the user becomes a provider by itself, which I think is the same idea which you have in classical product legislation. If you, for instance, have a car and you modify the car substantively, you cannot benefit anymore from the type approval. You have to get a new type approval, because it becomes at one point a new car. This is the idea. So you define with the intended purpose what kind of car this is, or what kind of AI this is. And this, I think, is the key feature for this definition, that you relate to the idea that there is not just one purpose, but there is a multitude of purposes and a multitude of different uses, how this AI system may later on be used.
Thank you, Kilian. I want to also, other than the debate about how to exactly define GPI, one of the points in the discussion so far that has proved a source of debate is the extent to which it is appropriate that open source should be included within the scope of any obligations for GPI. On the one hand, open source is important for technological development, but on the other hand, an exemption could provide the means for some providers to sidestep compliance with the AI Act. I'm wondering how our panelists might view this trade-off, and perhaps actually I could come to you, Brando, first on this point. How are you looking at this issue of open source in relation to GPI?
I still didn't hear your last question. Sorry, can you repeat? I don't know. I have a problem today with the audio.
I'll repeat. So I'm asking about open source and the extent to which this should be in the scope of any obligations on general purpose AI systems. So do you want to maybe share your thinking on that particular point?
Okay. Yeah. I will answer on that. Yeah. Okay, I understood. Sorry, I don't know. I have some problem with the connection.
That's okay.
I hope you can hear me well. On the open source, I have to say that although some colleagues favor an exception for the use of the open source, I and my group, we are a bit more cautious. The principle we are trying to avoid is that those who release this type of technology are exempt from responsibility and also liability for any damages resulting from downstream use, the effects of which are also due to the upstream design. There is no doubt about the value of the open source, but shifting all the obligations into the SMEs, because this is what I think would happen, is not, in my opinion, a good choice. So I would say I have this much more cautious approach, and we are still discussing about it.
Thank you, Brando. Can I pose the same question to Mark? Where do you stand on open source and its inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, I think, given how important open source is for development of AI systems. And I think it's only recently that we've seen a lot of companies produce very large systems and putting them out as open source, basically untested, to see what the public response is and to see if they can tweak these models before they maybe sell an improved version and then don't sort of provide it as open source, but provide it through an API interface, for example. So I think increasingly we feel that open source, as Brando has highlighted, needs to be addressed in the same way as any other AI system, to really avoid this phenomenon where companies offload their responsibility under the AI Act by publishing a model as open source and shirking responsibility. I mean, I was a little bit sneaky maybe in my opening remarks referring to Stable Diffusion, because that, of course, is an open source model where the CEO has said to people that if they want to use Stable Diffusion in a way that's generally deemed inappropriate, to then please do so on their own servers and not on sort of the companies. And I think that's really an example of an actor that isn't taking its responsibility seriously. And I think it's an example of an actor that I think ought to be addressed by regulators. And I think it's why it's caused such upheaval in the US House of Representatives as well, and why there's been this debate. So I would feel that we would also need to ensure that open source systems are in scope in one way or another. Jenny,
your perspective, please.
Yeah, thank you for these comments so far. I think the kind of the challenges and the trade-offs we see here is that on one side, we're aware that open source can bring significant downstream innovation, also potentially supports important safety and security research on general purpose AI in terms of providing open source models, has a lot of benefit in terms of research access and development. But we can't get away from the impact on affected persons at the end of the line, and that they also pose similar risks in a similar manner to closed source GPIs in many dimensions. And so there's a couple of scenarios we obviously want to avoid, would be kind of the open sourcing of commercial models, effectively kind of alleviating obligations. And we can see, particularly, I think, data we've been thinking about, there are kind of a minimum set of requirements that perhaps don't seem overly burdensome. Things like data quality evaluations, kind of in line with Article 10, technical documentation, Article 11. Without those, there could be really kind of low quality or risky models, and that products are then subsequently being built from, without any ability for downstream fine-tuners to assess the risks and understand the systems that they're building on top of. And so I think there's still challenges around kind of who the actors are in that place. Predominantly, to Mark's point, we've actually seen this dominated by kind of larger organizations or organizations with kind of commercial heft potentially attached, but you could imagine the scenario of a collective of open source developers being a more challenging kind of question around liability. But I think nonetheless, we still have to come down to what is the set of impacts on affected users and how can we help mitigate them.
Thank you, Jenny. Kilian, is this a point that the Commission has reflected on as you kind of observed the evolving discussions on general purpose AI systems?
No, of course, we are reflecting on this. This is an important question. I think I have to say, as Brando said, we are there still a bit in the reflection mode. I wouldn't say that we have a completely final position, because it's not an easy task. That perhaps just my thoughts. I think the key element for us is that we get it right, so that we get requirements for a general purpose AI which are feasible and do not kill innovation. And if we manage this, that in the end the system is well applicable to this kind of general purpose AI be presented as an open source, I think then that should be I think a feasible option, because in the end we have to make sure that it must be our purpose. We want to have this balance between innovation and trustworthiness, but we must as well make sure that every high-risk system provides the same level of trust and stability and robustness and accuracy, and that cannot depend on the way it has been developed. So that as well, we need as well to see that a little bit from the end. How can we make sure that after all, notwithstanding the value chain, how it has been developed, the result is as good as it would be if it had been directly developed for a given purpose. Therefore, we think, so one thing is really key is that we make that we really think it's true that the requirements fit for general purpose AI and do not pose an obstacle which is too difficult to overcome. And second, it's perhaps not an interesting idea what the council has put in this derogation for SMEs, in particular, so for small innovative companies, to release them a bit and there to have some opening. I mean, this is one of the ideas the council presidency has introduced. It's not related to the technology, it's related to the size of the company. It's a bit of a different approach, of course, but it's the idea, I think, is based on the fact that if a small innovative company comes up with such a tool, such a general purpose AI system, then it may not be able, or it may be more difficult for them to look at the requirement, and therefore to help them there. So that may as well cover quite a good part of innovative open source software.
Thank you, Kilian. Also, thank you for raising the point of SME.
I need, unfortunately, to leave for a meeting, but thanks for this opportunity. I hope I gave a few useful inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brando. We wish you the best. Kilian, I'm also aware that your time is getting on for you. You may have to leave momentarily. So if there are any sort of final remarks that you also want to make, then please feel free to do so.
No, first, I'm very sorry that I have to leave you, because this discussion is extremely exciting and I would like to stay much more. I think, yes, in the end, I think it's for me, but the discussion always shows that indeed it is worth further reflecting how we get it right. It's not a simple topic where you just have black and white how you can solve it. How we can adapt the rules in a way that we in the end ensure this high level of trustworthiness, I think, is key, so that we really think through, and that requires from our perspective a really good understanding of the value chain and a good understanding on who can do what in this chain, which in general purpose AI, of course, gets a bit more complex, because you do not only have one provider, but you may have then several providers down the line who have to cooperate in one way or another. And the second thing is, of course, how to organize this cooperation between these providers. Do you need rules for this, or do you just trust that the market will ensure that this cooperation will work out? I think these are for us the key questions against which we need to measure any kind of solution which we present. This being said, I wish you good continuation, and I'm very interested then to listen. I know this will be recorded, and to hear and to listen what you continue to discuss. So thanks a lot, and hope to speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kilian, for your participation. Much appreciated. So for our attendees, we will continue because we still have some time in our scheduled program. And I wanted to pick up on the point that Kilian was making in relation to SME exemptions. Obviously, this was a point as well that was reflected in the French text when it came to GPI. I hope I want to listen to your remarks. Mark, you talked about Google, Meta, Baidu, not SMEs in anybody's definition, no matter how creative you could get with that. So I'm just wondering how useful you think SME exemptions might be in relation to GPI generally.
Yeah, so I think most of our concerns, and I think the systems that we've analyzed in terms of potentially causing harm, are not produced by small companies. So I think it's not been top of our mind, I think. And when the council suggests that this, it's not been something that we found particularly concerning or had a very strong view on. When you look at the top 100 of sort of AI startups by valuation, there's only 3 that attempt to build general purpose AI systems. The other 97 are working on narrow use cases. So I think it kind of shows already that for most companies, this just isn't feasible. One example of a sort of startup, if you will, that is attempting to produce general purpose AI systems is Anthropic, but they are sort of cheating, if you will, because they were previously, or most of their team was part of OpenAI that operates under a license from Microsoft, and sort of split away to develop their own system. So I think it's quite rare to see SMEs attempt this. I think it'd be really good for competition if we can ensure this, and if we can find ways to support SMEs to perhaps compete in this space and ensure that it isn't a few companies that monopolize the future of AI, but there might be other ways to do that, for example, by helping them through funding or by supporting them in complying with the regulation rather than through a blanket exemption, which might not really help sort of solve the problem. I think the ultimate aim is to try and see if we can get SMEs competing rather than making the regulation a lot more confusing potentially.
Thanks, Mark. Jenny, I want to use your knowledge in particular just to get a bit more information about what is the sort of trend, within AI development. Obviously, we're talking about how you future-proof rules so that this legislation can have the longest shelf life possible. What are your observations on, the kind of general trends within AI development, and therefore what do we need to carefully take into account when we're talking about legislation in the AI Act?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think one of the big challenges about this is just how live these kind of changes are. If we think about it, DALL-E, which is OpenAI's large-scale image generation model, the first version of that only came out in January 2021, and it produced little 250 or 260 pixel by 260 pixel images, which only go so far, and yet a year later it was producing kind of large high quality images and considerably more feature rich and considerably more impactful. So we're seeing significant progress in the performance of more generalized models, and we're also seeing a really rapid productization, right? So taking that example again, Microsoft has already announced that it will be integrating that model into its Microsoft Designer products and its Edge browser, which in terms of going from new emerging technology into on the laptops of the masses is an incredibly fast turnaround. And so it feels like there is this trend towards a couple of pieces in this. One is towards more of these kind of broader purpose GPI foundational models as the starting point, and then finer training and tuning being the kind of space where we see more smaller actors, SMEs, step in. And also, I think there's also things around means of access and means of using these, right? Again, a lot of our thinking about this comes as like, we're thinking about this in a kind of product mindset, but we're also seeing a lot of kind of AI as a service type products where access and use of these models will be done via APIs. And so the actual product experience of building something like this will be, I'll hook into the API for this general purpose AI model, I'll hook that into the system that I'm building and the product I'm making, and then it will go out to the user. And so there's this kind of ongoing relationship between the original AI model generator and the product. And there's just a kind of a very different pattern of behaviors and interactions than maybe some of the kind of initial more context specific or product kind of bounded thinking of AI development may have sat at.
Thanks, Jenny. Do those observations resonate with you, Mark, or are there other things that you would also like to emphasize?
Yeah, no, I think what Jenny's highlighted in terms of how quick these systems go from sort of the development stage to potentially being integrated in Microsoft browsers or sort of end users get exposed to them is sort of a feature that the AI Act will need to grapple with, and potentially the AI board that the AI Act envisages can play a role in making sure that with the pace of the technology, we ensure that the regulation stays up to date, because as much as we try to foresee and analyze some of these developments now, there will definitely be developments that we can't foresee. But it was Tech Monitor, I think 1 or 2 years ago, that did some analysis on sort of the economic prospects for these systems, these large language models, these large general purpose AI systems, and where they're headed, expecting a doubling of the market size between 2022 and 2025 to $47 billion US dollars. And I think that sort of indicates the direction of travel. And I think Europe and sort of the AI Act ought to be ready for that, because as of yet, all of this development happens in the United States and China. And it's, I think it falls to Europe to also protect its citizens from some of the potential harmful impacts.
Thanks, Mark. I just want to come back a little bit to some of the options that are currently on the table or under discussion. Kilian was keen to emphasize in his introductory remarks the kind of risk-based approach the Commission took when they were crafting the original text, and some of the proposals on the table right now to regulate GPI, well, they would probably impose many, if not all, the obligations reserved for high-risk applications onto that technology. Do you think that's a fair expectation of systems, or do we need a more targeted approach, in your opinion? Maybe Mark, you start on that point, and then Jenny can follow up.
Yes, I mean, I think, and maybe in response to Brando's point, even though he's not here anymore, I think I can see that the institutions grappling with the fact that they want to preserve the integrity of the AI Act and its initial design, yet there is now this new class of systems that sort of poses different questions, and how you can sort of square that circle is a really tough and challenging question. I do think that some of the requirements in the AI Act can't be made to apply in full to general purpose AI systems. I think human oversight is a really good example of that, where it's really hard to ensure human oversight if the company doesn't know the exact use case in which a downstream provider might use the system. I think some logging requirements are also probably not feasible. Overall, I would say that operating a risk management system, some of the data and data governance requirements are examples of things that should definitely fall on the sort of general purpose AI system provider. But I do think there's some that they simply cannot abide by, which makes me think that we need something a little bit more creative and tailored than just classifying everything under the high risk bracket.
Thanks, Mark. Jenny, your thoughts on the same subject?
Yeah, I think I echo some of that, and maybe would also kind of add around that. I think first to flag that I guess we think it's not necessarily a huge ask to have providers comply with a set or many of the high risk requirements. It was China Bryson who kind of described even the full set of obligations as pretty lightweight in places. There's a kind of essentially mainly compelling due diligence via self-assessment by the companies themselves. That's what's kind of expected to occur in roughly 90% of use cases. Possibility of third-party checks by regulatory authorities are there, but would come further down the line. So also to remember the size of what we're asking in this isn't necessarily unusable, but then also to Mark's point about kind of where those responsibilities sit, and that is where there will need to be some kind of somewhat of a special regime, I think, needed for general purpose AI. In that I think, if we look at some of the obligations really need to sit on the original providers of potentially high risk AI alongside users, and some are more suited to users. So for instance, risk management, quality criteria, technical documentation, tests for system accuracy, robustness, cybersecurity, etc., make sense to happen both at the general purpose AI kind of provider level, but may also need to be repeated again at the user level at the point of kind of adaptation or integration into products, versus some of those points agreeing with Mark that record keeping throughout the life cycle, Article 12, provision of information to users, human oversight are quite challenging at that upstream stage, and really makes sense to sit more with users.
Thanks, Jenny. I've got a question that is coming in from our attendees for both of you. And that is, what is your sense of how mature the debate about general purpose AI is outside of the EU context? Someone, I think that in that case it was you, Mark, mentioned Representative Eshu in the US. Are there other countries that are grappling deeply with these issues who you think have a clear view of the trade-offs? Mark, as you were the one that mentioned Representative Eshu, maybe you could have a quick go at that, and then Jenny, I'll let you comment.
Yeah, I think the AI Act, in a sense, in Europe forces the debate to be a bit more mature than elsewhere, just because regulators have to make tough decisions now. And as we've heard from Kilian, the Council is wrapping up by December 6th, and the Parliament is also approaching its position. I do feel that some of the large companies, OpenAI, for example, is sort of leading that debate maybe in the private sector, where they have in their terms of use stated what uses GPT-3 can be used for and what it can't be used for, and therefore sort of in a way are introducing perhaps some norms that others can take an example from. But no, I would say that the debate on this is by far more mature in Europe. Although institutions such as NIST in the United States are also sort of debating some of these questions. So you definitely see, traces of the debate elsewhere.
Same question to you, Jenny.
Yes, I think I would echo that focus in terms of the EU conversation. ADA is based in both Brussels and London. I'm actually dialing in from London, and the conversation here is earlier in terms of AI regulation, although there is much interest in these issues. I think there are places where we're seeing provisions that could be relevant in other related kind of algorithmic governance discussions that maybe haven't yet come through to this discussion as much. So for instance, even places like discussions around trusted researcher access is happening quite a lot on the ground amongst civil society groups and in academia, and has kind of started and has gone further legislatively in conversations around the Digital Services Act and access to kind of social media platform systems. But I think actually is very relevant here to this conversation around general purpose AI and thinking about what kind of resourcing and supporting trusted research access could be. So I think there are conversations happening in other spaces that translate across really well. But I think we're really kind of here at the forefront at the moment.
Thank you, Jenny. Well, we are into our final minute, and both our institutional guests, Kilian and Brando, have left the discussion, but as Kilian mentioned, we are recording this. So maybe we use this final minute just for a few concluding remarks. I suppose your elevator pitch, if you like, to the institutions as they progress the discussion on the AI Act. Mark, let's start with you. What are your final concluding thoughts on this subject?
I'm going to steal my final thought from Jenny in the sense that this is not a big ask. I think that we're putting to these providers, that these are light requirements that I think are necessary to protect people, and we ought to apply them. And the second point I'd like to make in closing is that we really need to define the definition such that we only target those systems that are really of concern, and that we don't sort of loop in systems unnecessarily.
Okay, so Jenny, Mark, stole your thunder maybe. But is there something else you can you want to emphasize in your final conclusions?
I'm always happy to be given an extra few words. I guess for us, the effective regulation of general purpose AI systems will need to really recognize the potential complexity of the value chain right the way through to affected persons, the people in society that will be impacted by these systems. And how do we recognize that obligations, we'll need to capture obligations across providers, users, and the joint place between, but also ensure at the other end that affected persons are included in those mechanisms for oversight, for standard setting, and to Brando's point around human rights impact assessments, all the way through the AI Act in order to have that comprehensive governance system.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, Jenny, thank you for your time this afternoon. I thank Kilian and Brando in their absence. Thank you as well to our attendees. I hope you found it an insightful discussion. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.